But it's on you guys to remember everything now, right?
There's back.
Oh, yeah.
James.
Yeah. No worries.
Darby. It's Darby.
So, to get us started as to why is this story here, is I'd like to direct your attention to behind you. So if you look over the top of that hill, we see the tops of those trees kind of in the distance. That's where a town used to be. That was the town of Bay Point. That town was established by the Bay Point Lumber Company at the end of the 1800s because industry really liked this area. You see we've got these train lines. These start to come in around the early 1900s. And other industries that's in the area is going to be the chemical companies, gas, like we've got the Martinez refinery. And it's all because of the water here. This is a deep water port. Ships can sail all the way up here. They can continue further upstream. If you keep following it, it takes you all the way up to Sacramento, because the Sacramento River dumps into this bay. And if you follow it downstream, it takes you all the way out to the Golden Gate, out into the Pacific Ocean. It's still an active shipping lane today. We may see a ship go by, we may not. I don't know their schedule, but sometimes they show up right on time as I say that. But apparently I missed my timing today. So there's another industry at the time that has its eye on this place, especially after World War I, and that's going to be the U.S. Navy. Because, of course, just to our west, we can't see it from where we are today, but just to our west was the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. And after World War I, the Navy was looking to expand, in particular to have a munitions depot. But they couldn't do that over at Mare Island because, of course, the city of Vallejo had grown up over the years, and so they didn't want a munitions depot so close to a population center. So they looked at this general area, but ultimately didn't act upon it. Until, of course, the start of World War II. Does anybody here know who this man is? Recognize the image? Not quite. So this is Dory Miller. He enlisted in the United States Navy just before the start of World War II. And when he enlisted in the Navy, of course, all of the branches of the military were segregated. And the Navy was the most rigid in what jobs African Americans could hold as they served. So they were not allowed to serve in combat roles or on the front lines. They were only allowed to serve in menial jobs such as a mess attendant or a cook. Now, of course, this kind of flies in the face of the fact that African Americans have fought for this country since its creation. A great example is with the Emancipation Proclamation. It created the United States Colored Troops. This is the first time that formerly enslaved men were able to take up arms to ensure they remained free, and that those who were still enslaved in the Confederate States would gain their freedom as well. And yet, in 1925, there is a U.S. War Department memo that references a study. And this was the study on the use of African Americans in combat. And it found that African Americans were physically capable of combat, but that they could not control themselves in the face of danger. A direct quote from that study was, "He is mentally inferior to the white man." Dory Miller will completely disprove that memo. So Dory Miller was stationed on the USS West Virginia, which is one of the ships that was bombed during the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He was in the hold of the ship folding laundry, so doing his job. When the ship is hit, he'll make his way to the top deck where he finds the captain, pulls him to safety, and then Dory Miller will jump onto one of the guns of the ship and is credited with shooting down a number of Japanese planes. He was never trained in how to use the gun. If you've ever seen the movie Pearl Harbor, Cuba Gooding Jr. portrays him. Yeah. So, to honor him, the Navy will award him the Navy Cross, which we see here. This is the highest award that the Navy can give anybody, and Dory Miller is the very first African American to receive that award. The other thing they do is they put him on a recruiting poster, which is what we see here, and they send him around the country on a recruiting tour, encouraging other young men to answer the call of duty. When the recruiting tour is done, Dory Miller will go back to serving as a mess attendant. He'll ship out into the Pacific, where unfortunately the ship he was on will be torpedoed and sinks, and he does not survive the war. Now, quite a few young men will be inspired by Dory Miller, and they will enlist in the Navy. And so they will go to the Great Lakes Naval Training Center, which is just outside of Chicago. One thing I forgot to mention to you all is that town. So, after the start of the Great Depression, that town suffered greatly because industry left, right? So they try to revitalize the town, try to encourage people to come back. They take inspiration from the wind, the fact that we're out here on the water, maybe confuse those of us who are from the east with, other names, and so they decide to name the town Port Chicago. Yeah. So they will have a birthday party, they'll pave the streets, trying to entice industry to come back. Ultimately, what of course does bring industry back to the town is World War II. But we've got those connections with Chicago, because the young men who are going to their basic training in the Navy are just outside of Chicago. That is where the Great Lakes Naval Training Center is. Of course, the base is going to be segregated. And the part of the base that they are at is called Camp Robert Smalls. Has anybody ever heard the name Robert Smalls before? So Robert Smalls was an enslaved man who, during the Civil War, took control of a Confederate ship, brought along his family and some other folks who were enslaved, and they self-emancipated themselves by sailing that ship to U.S. lines. And he'll continue to fight for the United States Navy during the Civil War. So he's a naval war hero from that time period. After the war, he goes on to be a state legislator as well as a state senator in South Carolina, and even be a congressional representative for South Carolina. So the fact that these young men who've been inspired by Dory Miller are serving at a base named for another black naval hero is important. They've got folks that they can look up to, right? Has anybody here ever heard the phrase of the Double V campaign? It's a phrase that was coined by black newspapers during World War II, and it's the idea that African Americans were fighting two wars. So they're looking for two victories, the victory abroad over fascism, and a victory at home over racism. So it's easy to see how Dory Miller can fit into both aspects of that, right? He's demonstrating that they can stand up to danger, but also he's fighting the enemy at the time. So that's what these young men want to do. Be a part either of the victory abroad, they want that name recognition like Dory Miller, or to help further other African Americans here in the country and improve their station in life, right? So after their basic training, they'll be sent from the Great Lakes Naval Training Center all the way out here. Because after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Navy establishes the Port Chicago Naval Magazine. So these young men come all the way out here. This isn't the front lines. We're not out fighting or anything like that. So for these young men, it can be difficult for them to see how they could be a part of that Double V campaign. Because they're out here in the middle of nowhere. They're not close to the city. The closest town is, of course, Port Chicago, but it's not the most welcoming to them. If they choose to leave the base when they have leave, they're not going to be able to go to the movie theater or to the bars in that town. They're going to have to take a bus all the way to Oakland or into San Francisco. And even there, they're not always the most welcome. So some of the men will recall that they just never left the base. So they're very isolated out here on this segregated base. So it can be difficult for them to see how they play a role in all of this. But the job that they had here is vitally important. This is the largest munitions depot on the West Coast, and virtually all of the ammunition being used in the Pacific Theater is going to come through this base. So their job has to do with this. This here is known as a revetment, and the way it's designed is if there is an explosion in here, it will be directed up rather than out. Because as you see, we've got all these other hills, there are other revetments too. If there were to be an explosion out, you could have a chain reaction. So it's a safety procedure. Boxcars like this one will be filled with munitions that have been built at munitions factories all around the country. There's a question earlier of where did the munitions come from? The entire country. Because of course, what pulls the whole country out of the Great Depression is a shift in our economy to the wartime economy. So everybody, when we talk about Rosie the Riveter and shifting the Ford plants to building ships and stuff like that. So, munitions factories that build the munitions all across the country load up the boxcars. The boxcar comes into the revetment like this one, and then they will unload the munitions into the small temporary storage areas. So you see the concrete area there? It's just a small temporary holding place, because then the boxcar will go back out. In comes a smaller, lighter rail car, perhaps like a flatbed rail car, and the men will load the munitions onto that, and then that lighter rail car will go out to the end of the pier. So when we walked through the memorial over here and you saw those pilings, that is the remnants of the pier. And so, if I've got a picture that we can look at, I'll come around. So this is the revetment we're at, so we're standing here, so that's what you're seeing. Okay? This is the revetment we're standing at, we're here. You saw that part of the pier, just the front part. So we're here at this revetment, we're seeing that part of the pier out there. Okay? So this is the revetment, we're seeing this part of the pier out there. So when the rail cars are fully loaded, they can go all the way out to the end of the pier, because that's where the ships will be docked so that they can then load the ships.
Did they put tracks on the pier?
Yeah. All the way to the end.
Awesome.
So the whole point of their job here is load, unload, load. Load, unload, load. Keep doing it faster and faster. They're going to work in 8-hour shifts, so they're covering a 24-hour time period. So it's constant, just loading and getting the ships out. When these young men were at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center, they were not given specific training in the handling of munitions. When they arrived here, they were not given specific training in the handling and loading of munitions. They were not given safety procedures, and they were not given an education on what it was they were loading. They just arrived and were told to load and keep doing it. Because, as I mentioned, virtually all the munitions that are being used in the Pacific Theater come through here. So the Pacific Theater, with its island hopping campaign, is utilizing a lot of munitions, so they need to move things quickly. May of 1944, the pier that's out here was expanded so that 2 ships could be loaded at once. So you have one on the land side and one on the water side. In this picture, we just have 1 ship. There's a second set of pilings you might be able to see over here. That's a second pier that was under construction by May of 44, with plans to be able to load another 2 ships. And they even had plans to build a third pier where another 2 ships could be loaded. So it's all about getting things through here quickly.
So did they have lights at night so they're on the 24 hours?
Yeah.
The place was lit up enough so they could see what they were doing?
Yep. Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Now, these men understood that they were handling very dangerous tools, of course, and so they will be concerned because they haven't been given any training or anything, and so they will ask their officers, who of course are all white, do we need to be concerned? Do we need to know anything about what we're handling? And they are assured, don't worry about it, the bombs are not live, they don't have their detonator pins. Keep loading. Do it again. This is going to bring us to the night of July 17th, 1944. On that night, there are 2 ships out at the pier. On the land side, so closest to us here, will be the E.A. Bryan. This ship is almost completely full. They are doing their final checklists. It'll probably set sail the following day. On the water side is the Quinault Victory. This is a brand new ship. She's on her maiden voyage. She had just stopped in Martinez to be refueled, and so she's waiting for them to start loading her. And on the pier, in between the two, are 16 rail cars filled with munitions. It's in the evening, so the day shift has already gone back to the barracks, which is less than a mile away, so they're settling in for the night. Now the night shift is on. So they're getting ready, and something's going to happen. We don't know exactly what, but at 10:18 p.m., there will be 2 explosions, 6 seconds apart. The E.A. Bryan disappears. The Quinault Victory will be ripped in half and flung 500 feet off the coast. The pieces of metal that you see here are likely from the Quinault Victory. There was an airplane flying over at the time, and the pilot recalls seeing pieces of debris going above the plane, so that it was flung 2 miles up into the air. In the town of Port Chicago, every single building will be severely damaged. Bless you. Folks who are in the movie theater that night recall having the roof blown off of it while they're watching the movies. Young men who have just settled in to go to bed in their barracks are flung from their beds. There will be 390 injuries from the surrounding area, and the number 1 injury is lacerations from flying glass. If any of you went through the John Muir house before, the front door, there's a window above the front door, it has a crack in it. That's from this explosion. This registered as a 3.4 on the Richter scale in Berkeley, and windows in San Francisco were broken. It was felt as far away as Boulder City, Nevada, which is 500 miles away. And all 320 lives who were down here are gone in an instant. Of those 320, 202 are African American.
So when you say 320 lives, more than the people who were just engaged in the operation of loading?
Every single person who was down here working in the loading, gone. 320 men.
Including the people in the ships?
Everybody. Of that 202, that's the African American men who were loading. That constitutes 15% of all African American casualties during World War II. Those who are not too severely injured in the barracks are going to come down to try to figure out what had happened. The electricity that they used at the time is all gone, of course. It's been cut off because of the explosion, so they can't see anything. But what they can see is the boxcar in this revetment is on fire. So there's the potential for another explosion. So 5 young men will come down here and put out that fire, preventing another explosion. They will be awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for their bravery. In the light of day, they can truly see the extent of the damage. That pier is completely reduced to splinters. But also in the light of day, unfortunately, we'll begin the job of cleanup, which is going to primarily be body cleanup, recovering the bodies, or to be more clear, unfortunately, body parts. Of those 320, only about 50 are able to be identified. They are today buried in the Golden Gate National Cemetery in South San Francisco. So if you have the opportunity, I do encourage you to go over and pay your respects to those men there. Now, that's a lot. That's some pretty heavy history. I'd like us all just to take a moment and reflect upon it. If you want to, you can walk around the revetment, kind of see how this works, and then make your way over to the memorial. Those panels over there list all 320 names of those men who were killed that night. And then we'll regroup on the plaza, because the story doesn't end here. everybody's going to wonder what happened, what caused the explosion. So there will be an investigation into the cause, and it's going to last all the way up until October 30th. So keeping our timeline in mind, July 17th is the explosion, October 30th is when the report is handed in. And it determines it was an accident. We will never know exactly what caused the explosion, but it gives some examples. Perhaps something was dropped. Perhaps something fell. Perhaps the winches that they used to load the ships earlier that day, they'd had some mechanical issues, so perhaps that had failed and something was dropped. Perhaps the water got rough and the ship was jostled and something fell, and that's what caused it. We'll never know exactly what, but it was an accident. And yet, the investigation will lay the blame squarely at the feet of the black sailors. A direct quote from the investigation is that the enlisted personnel were poor material for the training and handling of loading of munitions.
That they had not been trained.
So, this is a very dangerous job that requires training. The Navy determines that these men cannot be trained to do the job, so they don't train them to do the job, but they have them do the job. So these men were set up to fail. Now bear with me with our timeline. We got to go back in time, so we'll keep it all on track. So again, in that immediate aftermath, when the black sailors are cleaning up the bodies that they're finding here, the white officers will be given 30 days of bereavement leave. This is pretty standard of practice. This is a horrific experience. So they get transferred to other duties. They can go visit their families, process and heal what they just went through, heal from that. The black sailors believe that they will also get that, but of course they do not. Instead, they will be put on barracks duties. So they're transferred to other locations in the area, like, for example, Mare Island, and they're just kind of in a holding pattern. So they're not really doing anything. They still have to get up each day, follow orders, fall into line, march, that sort of thing, but they don't have a job. So there's a lot of sitting around and wondering and questioning what happened, what caused this, because of course they don't know yet. So they are also, of course, dealing with what happened to their friends. And on top of that, some level of survivor's guilt. So they've got the trauma of the explosion, the trauma of cleanup, and then the trauma of just sitting there and not really being able to heal. I can only imagine the level of PTSD that these young men went through. And of course, at the time, we didn't have the phrase of PTSD. They'll be on barracks duties for a couple of weeks until on August 9th, they will be marched out of the barracks down towards the docks. And they realize that they're going down to loading munitions again. Now, in those couple of weeks, everything has changed because now they fully understand how dangerous their job is. They know that they were misinformed and that the bombs were alive, that they do need to be careful. But also, nothing's changed because they've not been given any training, they've not been given any safety procedures, and they've not been given an education on what it is they were loading. So everything has changed, and nothing has changed. So when they realize what they are being tasked to do again, 258 of those men will stop and say no. They are willing to obey any other order except the order to load munitions. So in response, the Navy will put them on a prison barge. And they are there for 3 days. They have to think about the consequences of their actions. They will be told that their families will be ashamed of them. They are called cowards, and they are threatened with death by firing squad if they do not go back to loading munitions. So after those 3 days, 208 of those men will say, okay, we'll do it. We'll go back to loading. Not all is forgiven. Of course, for those 208, they will be docked 3 months' pay and charged in a summary court-martial. The remaining 50 will continue to say no. They want safe working conditions. So the Navy will take that group and puts them on trial for mutiny. They try them as a group. This will be the largest mass mutiny trial in naval history, so they become known as the Port Chicago 50. Their trial will take place out on Yerba Buena Island. So when you cross the Bay Bridge, that's the island you're driving across. If you go out there today, there's a brand new park out there. It's up on the top. It's called Panorama Park. Treasure Island Museum just recently put in some commemorative panels telling the story of the Port Chicago 50 because the park is 300 feet away from the location of the building where their trial took place. You're fine. So the trial will begin on September 14th. So keeping our timeline in mind, July 17th is the explosion, August 9th is the work stoppage, September 14th is the start of the trial. The Navy recognizes that they could probably be accused of, I don't know, racial discrimination, since the whole group of the Port Chicago 50 are all black. So they attempt to make it clear that it has nothing to do with their race. It's all about the fact that they refused an order. That's what this trial is about. The trial will continue up through October 9th. By that point, the prosecution has made the case that these men conspired to commit a mutiny. Now the defense will get up and make its case, and it will put some of the men on the witness stand, hear from them their own personal experiences. And there will be some revelations in this trial, one of which has to do with the Coast Guard. During World War II, the Coast Guard was in charge of port security. So prior to the explosion, the Coast Guard had been out here, they observed the operations, and they gave the Navy an order. Train these men and give them safety procedures. And the Navy said, no, that gets in the way of our operations. We will follow your order if you change it to meet our needs, but we will not follow that order. It's also revealed that the officers were betting on whose unit could load the fastest. So they're racing their units against each other, posting their times, offering out rewards if they meet or exceed those times, and dangling punishment if they don't meet the times. Safety truly was not important here. It's also going to be revealed that on August 9th, they were never explicitly given an order to go back to loading. So how can they be accused of mutiny if they can't even be truly accused of disobeying an order because they never got the order? It's also revealed that some of the men who are in the Port Chicago 50 weren't even there on that day of August 9th. They were in the sick bay. Now, October 9th is also an important day because on that day, Thurgood Marshall will be in the audience. The NAACP was very aware of this trial, and so they sent him out as legal defense to observe. He was a civilian, so he could not represent the men because this was a military trial. But what he could do was take their case to the court of public opinion. Encourage people to understand that it should be the Navy that should be on trial for how it treated these men, rather than these men being on trial. Ultimately, the trial will end on October 24th with a verdict of guilty of mutiny. That will carry with it a sentence of 8 to 15 years of hard labor. So these men will be sent down to Southern California to serve that out. Just a couple days later, on October 30th, the investigation is finalized. So the entire trial happened before the investigation was complete. That is a very fast trial. Couple things that come out of all of this, from the explosion, from the trial, from the investigation, is the Navy determines that they need to train the men. They need to give them safety procedures. It's also determined that they need to rotate men through this base more frequently. It can't, some of the Port Chicago 50 had been here for over 2 years, so they need to come through more frequently. It's also determined that it can't be just black units loading, so then they'll also bring in some white units as well. With the end of World War II, the Navy recognizes that the punishment, as well as the verdict, is punitive. I mean, the entire trial was meant to send a message to other African Americans serving in the military. Do not step out of line during wartime. So at the end of the war, this is far too much, and they will quietly release all of the Port Chicago 50 by the end of January of 1946. Now, the really big thing that comes out of all of this is going to be February of 1946. Because in February, the Navy will end its practice of segregation. The most rigid in what roles African Americans could have, the Navy becomes the first to desegregate. The rest of the military will not do so until President Truman's order in 1948. After all of this story kind of gets pushed aside. The Navy's not proud of it, so they're not going to talk about it. And the Port Chicago 50 are not proud. They carry that with them, the label of mutineer. So this story will quietly be forgotten for the next 40 years. And then in the 80s, there will be a young African-American researcher at Cal who's going through the archives, and he finds a pamphlet that the NAACP had put out in 1945 in an attempt to overturn the verdict. And this pamphlet will stop this young man, and his name was Dr. Robert Allen, stops him in his tracks with the words, "Remember Port Chicago? You should." And he says, I don't know this story. What is this? So he starts to do his research. And then he decides to track down the Port Chicago 50. Now, this is 40 years later. These young men, when they were serving here, were 17, 18, 19 young men, right? 40 years later, they should still be alive. Unfortunately, quite a few of them had already died. So you have to think, again, that's all that trauma that they went through, and then also that label of mutineer, unfortunately cut these lives short.
What percentage?
We don't know.
Oh,
So he's only able to find some of them, and he will meet with them and interview them, conducting oral histories, hearing in their own words what happened here. Many of the men will not meet with him in their homes because they've never told their families about this. So he will collect these stories and writes the very first book, which is called The Port Chicago Mutiny. So that book puts us on the journey to get us to where we all are today. Because the next thing that comes out of his work and raising awareness of this story will be this memorial. The Navy puts this in 1994. That's, of course, also why it's a heavy focus on the lives lost rather than the whole story, right? In 1999, there's what we believe only the last 3 of the Port Chicago 50 still alive. And President Clinton will offer them the opportunity to apply for a presidential pardon. Now, the issue with this is a presidential pardon forgives you for doing something wrong, but it's still an acknowledgement that you did something wrong. So 2 of those men will say, no, we did nothing wrong. The definition of a mutiny is taking over a base violently or taking over a ship at sea. They did not do that. All they did was say, can we have safe working environment? So they say no. The 3rd man, Freddie Meeks, will accept the pardon, not because he thinks that they did anything wrong. He agrees. They did nothing wrong. They did not commit a mutiny. But he recognizes that there is now a presidential level attention on their story. Helps to elevate their story just a little bit more. The next big advancement will come in 2009 when President Obama signs us into law as a national memorial, part of the National Park Service. We are his very first park that he creates. But still, the Port Chicago 50 were labeled as mutineers. Until July 17th, 2024, 80 years to the day of that explosion, Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro exonerates them. He exonerates the Port Chicago 50 and the 208 who'd initially also said no. 3 days later, on this plaza, he was here to also make this announcement as a part of our annual commemoration. We had 460 people on this plaza. Among them were, of course, descendants of the Port Chicago sailors. Descendants of those who'd been killed, those who survived, as well as those who were newly exonerated. So I'd kind of like to bring it all back with a quote. This comes from Robert Smalls at the 1879 South Carolina Constitutional Convention. He said, "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." The sailors who were killed here that night did not have that equal chance. The 208 did not have that equal chance. The Port Chicago 50 did not have that equal chance. Steps are being made to give it back to them, like the exoneration. But a huge step is what you all are doing today, coming here and learning this story, helping us to elevate this story to the level of national consciousness, like sites like Gettysburg. So that the next time you all hear the phrase, "Remember Port Chicago?"
you can say, we do. And I thank you all so much for helping us with